or in a second, I should say. All right, welcome everybody. Well, to this CySER seminar, the very first one for the spring semester. For those who are new, I know there is a couple of new people. My name is Asafo Gabramajan, and usually Noel Schulz would be the one to introduce seminar speakers, but she's traveling in Kenya, and so I am doing the introduction on her behalf. And today I've got the great pleasure of introducing Rob Crossler, who is a colleague of mine here at WSU. Rob is an associate professor of information systems at the Carson College of Business at Washington State University. He serves as the department chair of the Department of Management Information Systems and Entrepreneurship, and he holds the Philip Case Distinguished Professorship in Management Information Systems. His research focuses on things that affect security and privacy decisions of individuals, and he has made great contributions recognized both by academic peers and industry. He is also a member, a senior personnel in the CySER Institute, and he leads the effort to have the CySER Basic Certificate for those of you who are familiar with it. And so today he will be talking about behavioral security research in information systems, and I am, without any further ado, going to give the time to Rob. And just to make clear things, if you have questions, you can put them in the chat, and I will be drawing attention to them when the time comes. So Rob, the floor is yours.
Perfect. Can everybody see my screen? We good? Okay. Awesome. Well, thank you for having me and for the great introduction. This research that I'm going to present today, entitled Behavioral Security Research, I was thinking about it today. How long have I been doing this? And really, I've been researching in this space since I started my doctoral program in 2005. Which crazily is almost 20 years, which it's kind of crazy to think about how long I've been doing this. So you'll see in this presentation this research goes back a fair way. So I wanted to start off by saying and talking about what is behavioral security research. And so I took this quote out of a paper that I wrote back in 2013 in Computers and Security. That you can all read, but what I would basically say that behavioral security research focuses on the behaviors of individuals and what helps determine and helps us to understand why people behave the way they do when it comes to protecting information assets. And that can be broadly defined, anything from access to their computer hardware, their networking infrastructure, organizational information that they may have. It may include things such as why people comply or don't comply with security policies. So pretty broadly defined towards understanding user behaviors. This was the topic of my dissertation and something I've spent a lot of time writing about and thinking about. The vast majority of the papers, and I'm going to share with you today, take an approach of collecting data from individuals. So a lot of this research is driven by surveys, and I probably can't perfectly recall exactly what each one of these papers used for their sample source, but many of them either come from in the early days, oftentimes convenient samples of students were the easiest way to collect data. More recently, you see a lot of data that is collected from market panels, whether it's going out to Amazon Mechanical Turk and asking for workers to complete surveys in exchange for a nominal amount of money. Alternatively, Prolific is another source of data that's used where you pay Prolific, and also Qualtrics provides this service as well, a certain amount of money per respondent, say $5 to $10 per respondent who meets certain qualifications. So the more specific you get in qualifications, the more expensive it is. I had one data collection where we wanted to have individuals from families. So we had a parent and a teenage, or a parent and the teen, and to have those over 2 data points in time. And it was about anywhere from $20 to $40 a respondent, depending on how we define that in that data collection effort. So depending, it gets fairly expensive to collect data, but sometimes it can be done fairly cheaply. I've done some Amazon Mechanical Turk studies where we've paid $1 per respondent. So it's ranging in what you get there, and various ways you can go about to ensure that you have quality in data responses. So when I was asked to present today, I thought about what would be most interesting. I thought about going a deep dive into a singular study that I've done. But given this audience and most of the people here are probably more technical in nature, coming from engineering or computer science, I thought it'd be more interesting to go over broadly what is behavioral security research and what are some of the theories that we've touched on, what do we use, what have we learned, and then ultimately to close with some current studies I have either in the review process or approaching the review process, and letting you guys see what some of that stuff is. By all means, if someone has a question, I'm not reading the chat, but if somebody could interrupt me and let me know there's questions, that would be ideal. So feel free, Gabriel or Asafa, to interrupt me, and I will answer questions as we go along.
Sounds good.
So the first study I want to talk about, and this kind of laid the foundation for what is behavioral security research, was a paper by Detmar Straub, who's one of the leading researchers in the in information systems, but he did a fair amount in the information security space as well. Drew on criminology and the theory of general deterrence, which we'll see again here in a little bit. But basically what he proposed and what seems to hold similar to it, how it does in criminology, is that there are deterrents in place that can help deter computer abuse from happening. And so what are those? And then what are some other reasons why people might abuse computers or not? How do we put preventative measures in place? How do we motivate people to either encourage or discourage abuse? What environmental factors exist that would encourage abuse to happen? And so put this together as some initial thoughts towards how do we prevent computer abuse. And in a later paper, the same author put together what's called the security action cycle, which has driven a lot of justification for cybersecurity research in this behavioral space. And the whole idea is we want to ultimately deter people from abusing information resources. And in a perfect world, we would deter it all early on in that process. And so we discover and uncover ways to stop people from making decisions that would be abusive in the first place, all the way down to remedies. And, basically something has been abused and then we need to fix the fact that this information's been lost, assuming we ever find out about it. So we want to minimize basically that stuff that goes on. And so we think about articles that we see in the news every day. They happen at some level of this deterrence feedback. If you've deterred people, oftentimes that actually doesn't make headlines. It's when things have been detected and ultimately some abuse has happened that we see about it and we learn about it. But at various different stages, we can do things hopefully to prevent or deter abuse of information resources. And so we'll see that as kind of the underlying objective in a lot of these studies. So the first, sorry, I'm going to go backwards. My screen is doing something funny. The first theory that I want to talk about is general deterrence theory. And this is an extended model of general deterrence theory. And we'll see this with a lot of the theories that we have utilized in information systems. Is you'll have your standard theory, your basic theory, and then there'll be more understanding, trying to get even more nuanced understanding towards why people behave a certain way. And in the case of general deterrence theory, what we have as a dependent variable is people's intention to misuse information systems, resources, or information. And general deterrence theory would tell us that the perceived certainty and the perceived severity of sanctions will deter people from misusing these resources. So if I know that I'm going to be caught, and I know getting caught is going to be very, very bad, then I'm more likely to comply with policy and to do something in line with what an organization would expect me to do. So these relationships have fairly regularly been supported, as we understand, okay, that makes sense that these the certainty of these sanctions, the severity of these sanctions would make a difference. What about our employees' awareness of the policies? If I don't know what the organization's policies are, then I may not understand the certainty or the severity of the sanctions. And so increasing people's awareness of these policies, increasing their awareness of the programs that they can participate to learn about these things, as well as being aware of their behavior being monitored, can oftentimes increase those other perceptions, ultimately leading to less likely to misuse an information system. Adding to that theory, a later paper came and discussed the theories of neutralization. And so they took and had the sanctions. They hypothesized both formal and informal sanctions as part of that from general deterrence theory, leading to intention to violate a policy as well as shame. And then they brought in this theory of neutralization, which basically says people will make excuses for why they violate policies, and found that that these ideas, these neutralization techniques, that people absolutely did justify their behavior, and those justifications led to an intention to violate policy. Some of you may be wondering how you can measure people's actual intention to violate a policy. One of the really neat things that this paper did was they borrowed from the criminology literature what's called a factorial survey design. And with the factorial survey design, what you can do is you can propose to people through a vignette some third party and a behavior that they ultimately did. And at the end, you could say, what's the likelihood that you perform similarly to this person? So for example, a vignette might say something like, Pat, oftentimes a gender neutral name, so we don't assign a gender to the person who made this decision, was traveling on the road and they needed access to files that were in the work office that only they had the password to be able to access. In order to ensure that they could do their job, they shared their password with their colleague who was able to gain access to that file. So what's the likelihood that you would have acted like Pat did? And so the criminology literature tells us that this is a good way to remove people from the bias they would have to say, no, 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 I would never violate a policy, to say, well, yeah, there's a chance I would behave similarly to the character in that scenario. And so that's what they used in this case, and in a lot of these studies, to look at the likelihood that someone else would similarly violate a security policy. So this, about the same time this work in general deterrence theory was going on, the protection motivation theory became another theory that was borrowed from the health psychology literature. And this is actually the theory that I utilized in my dissertation. And we'll see some studies where I've used it along with some other theories later on in my career. But what this study basically, or this theory basically proposes, and there's various different ways this has been put together, is that people go through a coping appraisal process and they go through a threat appraisal process where they basically say, is there a threat that I need to worry myself with protecting? And am I capable of doing the recommended action to protect from this threat? And so where this was borrowed from was in the health literature. There may be a recommendation that if you wear sunscreen, you can prevent getting cancer. And so what that research said was, if I believe that there's a threat of getting skin cancer and it would be bad, that I would say, okay, I need to do something about it. And then if I believed that wearing sunscreen actually prevented me from getting skin cancer, and I believed I had the ability to apply sunscreen regularly to keep myself from getting skin cancer, then I would either perform that behavior or have the intention of performing that behavior. And so the perceived threat severity and the perceived threat susceptibility is that threat appraisal process. How bad is it? In this case, skin cancer, or in the case of information security, we would look at things like my computer being infected with malware. In 2010, that was a pretty big area of user behaviors, was running anti-malware software and making sure you update that regularly. But how severe would it be if and how likely is it that I would get files infected, my computer would be infected with malware? And then what is the effectiveness? What do I perceive response efficacy, the effectiveness of using anti-malware software is on preventing that? And do I believe that I actually am capable of updating my anti-malware software? So this is the foundational theory of protection motivation theory. In this case, they also included the construct of social influence. And what social influence would argue, and it comes from a lot of the technology acceptance literature and places where we look at people's use of technologies, says that what other people think I should do, I am likely to do likewise. So we saw that with protection motivation theory. Technology threat avoidance theory came out at about the same time, which they gave it a different name, technology threat avoidance theory, but in essence, it was protection motivation theory. And it basically says the same thing, but they, instead of calling it intention, they called it avoidance motivation, which would ultimately lead to avoidance behavior. But it's the same idea that these perceived threats and my perceived likelihood of being able to do something about it would lead to my behavior to avoid that threat. Borrowing on some literature we had on habit, another paper built on protection motivation theory and showed that habit was a predecessor to our constructs in that coping appraisal and threat appraisal process. As you can see here with protection motivation theory, threat appraisals weren't set up as leading towards coping appraisals. A few different ways that that's been theoretically modeled, but brought in the whole concept of habit. The more habitual behaviors become, the more likely it is that I'm going to see the threats there and that I can cope with it. One of the core features of protection motivation theory, if we look at the originating literature, is the whole idea of fears. And so you see here they have a dotted box around the conventional fear appeals elements. That whole idea of the threat appraisal and the coping appraisal is motivated by the idea that if I am fearful enough, I will do something. So they didn't actually measure fear here, but they had these appeals in the process of this study where they had people read what would be some sort of a training that would hopefully increase or enhance the fear or that threat appraisal, which would lead to compliance. And you'll see here that they have sanction, severity, and certainty, both formal and informal, which draws from the general deterrence theory. And they also added sanction celerity, which is the whole idea that how quickly that sanction would happen actually matters. So if I could get away with something or knew I could get away with it for a year, would that be different than if I knew I would be caught immediately? And so they drew on that to ultimately bring these theories together and have a better understanding of what leads to compliance intention. So a paper that I did with a couple of doctoral students that we published in 2017 added to protection motivation theory the self-determination theory. So self-determination theory in this picture is the constructs that have the S next to them. So what it's getting at is, am I motivated to do the response? Do I feel I have the autonomy to do what I would like in the response? Am I competent, and is this behavior related to actually protecting what's going on? And we found that bringing these two theories together provided a richer understanding of what led to behavioral intention. One of the things that I like to describe from this study that seemed to resound with a lot of people is when it comes to something like using a password management software. There's more than one password management software that's out there, right? You have LastPass, you have OnePass, you have your keychain baked into an Apple device. It doesn't really matter which of those password management softwares your employees would use. But if you give people the autonomy to feel like, you know what, I should be using something, right? I'm going to have better passwords. I'm not going to be reusing them. My behavior will ultimately be better. But I feel like I can choose the one that works best with how I work, with how it interfaces with my computer and so forth. I'll be more likely to comply with that behavior. So by giving people that autonomy, it really did make a difference in their intention to follow a policy. Another study that I just recently had published in Computers and Security drew on stewardship theory in addition to protection motivation theory to actually describe or explain people's violation of information security policies. And interestingly, in our results, fear ultimately was the strongest motivator to ISP compliance. But some of the stewardship theory factors did make a difference. And so what the takeaway from this was that, yes, when it comes to policies and getting people to follow them, we need to go through the same sort of process of letting them know there's a threat, giving them the skills to know they're capable of it. But we also need to cultivate an environment where people feel like they are part of the organization, that the organization is providing them resources to do their job and so forth. And the more engaged and the more people feel like they are part of the organization, it's going to help with getting them to comply with the policies that we want them to comply with. In 2018, basically with all these various different theories that were out there, and I haven't talked about all of these, but there were a lot. Researchers went and collected data to be able to test all of these theories and went through a process to find out which of the constructs we've been looking at do the best at overall explaining what leads to intention. And so the whole idea of response efficacy and that threat appraisal leading to fear held, and then fear as a leading indicator to intention, as well as habit and role values leading to intention. But reactance is different than intention. So intention is I'm going to comply. Reactance is I'm going to keep doing what I was doing before. So it's the opposite end of that spectrum. So as people neutralize, which we saw in an earlier study, and as fear is present, they may actually give you a behavior that is inconsistent with what we would want, which would be compliance with the overall policies. So this paper is another paper that found protection motivation theory held, and they put this forward as a theory that says if you're going to use protection motivation theory, they argued, this is the instantiation of these relationships that you actually should be using. They went back to the original theory as well as the data to support this theory as the correct, true way it should be done. It's interesting, as I talk to my friends and colleagues in this space, not everybody actually agrees with what this paper says. Part of the whole argument in this conversation. Another group of researchers decided to, instead of collecting data, to ultimately test whether or not we had the right constructs for explaining security policy violation or compliance, went and did a meta-analysis. And so in a meta-analysis, they took the data from all of the papers that they could find that ultimately tested antecedents either to security policy compliance or security policy violation. And then from that, they were able to statistically show that all of these actually made some level of a difference towards security policy compliance. And then they were moderated. So relationships were strengthened or weakened by these various different moderators. So, from this, as research gets built and move forward, we can draw on this to say, here's some more reasons why we would expect certain relationships to exist as we study different contexts and different security policies that we might be looking at. So another earlier study in 2009 basically found that mandatoriness actually was a big factor, that if people were mandated to take precautions in the workplace, that they would. And if you're not mandated to do it, you wouldn't, which seems somewhat obvious, right? But they collected data. They found that it did matter, that our expectations were supported as we talked to people and collected data from them. Another paper that I published in 2021 looked at the self-determination theory again. So looking at self-determined motivation and ultimately leading towards the dependent variables of learning effort, the amount of effort people would put into learning to do a security behavior, or how well they would perform. And the way that this study was put together is we did this in a lab, and we did it with students that were taking a database course. And they were given a little bit of information, but not a ton, but really to spark their interest in detecting or figuring out whether or not how to prevent SQL injection scripts from happening and being effective in the SQL they were developing for this website. And so, before they entered into this lab, we captured various different determinants, those perceived values at the beginning, as well as some interest in security. So if they're really interested in things, what effect would that have? And then they would go through a process of trying to figure out how to prevent SQL injection scripts from being successful. And we had 3 different levels of difficulty in this, from fairly easy to fairly hard. And depending on various different factors, some people gave up. They just quit after, maybe they did the first one. And other people who were more interested in cybersecurity and so forth were more likely to stick with it and to actually put in the effort, and hopefully also actually they did lead to the performance of being able to do well. So people's interest in whether or not you have employees, and this was the takeaway in this one, if you have employees that are working in the technology space, that if they have a level of interest in cybersecurity, that you may actually be able to train them into doing cybersecurity work as opposed to non-cybersecurity work. So we were making the argument here that people's interest might be one way of helping to create more cybersecurity workers in the workforce. The construal level theory is a more recent paper that basically showed that the more concrete a message was, the more likely it would be to affect people's protection motivation theory variables. So the threat appraisal, the coping appraisal, and then ultimately compliance with the policy. The context also showed to matter. So if we're talking about workplace compliance, if it's going to affect them personally, people are more apt to do something than if it's just going to affect the organization. So people are more driven by their personal threats than just organizational. And then another paper, also more recently published, looked at the individual values, so experience and agreeableness towards knowing what's going on in security, as well as how relevant it is to the system that they're working in, and that those factors then led to that situational information security awareness, which then led into the protection motivation theory aspect of things. And so the more experience people had, the more agreeable they were to what was going on, or the less agreeable, I take that back, led to their awareness of what's going on. And then if it related to the system and the messages that they were receiving were actually appropriate, then they would be more aware and ultimately would influence their behaviors. Another paper that I published with a doctoral student was looking at this whole idea of flow and how likely it would be to conform with the policy and comply with it. And the whole idea of this is if you think about video games, and this is what Spurt is thinking. When you're playing a game, sometimes you get so into it that you just make decisions and you don't really even think about it. And his idea was people might get so into wanting to do their job that they'll get into a state of negative affective flow, and they will then not comply with the policy because they just want to be able to do their job. And this was a fun experiment that he conducted using Microsoft Excel, where participants were in one of two groups. And in one of them, they were given these calculations they had to make and about how many widgets to order. And in one condition, the math worked, and they would be within 90%. It'd say good job, and they were doing well. And then about halfway through making these decisions, they were prompted with, you have an opportunity to get someone to help you. If you provide them with your password, they'll give you help. Those people who were in that condition that they were doing well oftentimes didn't provide their password. On the alternatives, people were in a condition that regardless of how well they calculated how many they needed to order, they were always wrong. The math never worked, the predictions were wrong, and they ultimately, then when they were prompted to share their password, would give that away. And to control for that, to see that they were ultimately entering into that negative state, we captured frustration through some survey questions, and people who were frustrated were even less likely to comply. So that even amplified this even more. And an interesting thing happened in this study. The students were told, they were deceived in this data collection, that their performance on this task would result in the extra credit they would get for the class. And so the students who were doing poorly were getting really frustrated because they weren't, at least in their mind, going to get any extra credit for this class. And there was at least one student who got up and slammed his keyboard onto the desk and told the doctoral student who was collecting data what he thought of him and his extra credit. And ultimately, we did do a debrief with everybody, but especially with that student, said, let him know he was getting the extra credit and it was part of the study. But a good reason why we had IRB permission to do that. And we followed the rules exactly as they told us to for doing the study. But the frustration was there, and the results then showed in the study. A paper that I currently have under the review process with a doctoral student here at WSU. We took that study that brought 11 theories together, and one of the factors they had was role values. But they didn't define role values in their paper. They actually gave no definition for what it was. And it acted kind of weird. We actually, in another data collection, were unable to replicate what they were doing. And so this student found another values theory called Schwartz's value types And it has in it conservation and openness to change, self-transcendence, and self-enhancement, which we hypothesize leads to intention to comply, along with the other factors that came from that combined theory. And what we found was that values actually, these role values, or these values that he actually captured during his dissertation, matter a lot towards intention to comply, and does almost a better job than some of the other factors in the original theory. And then more recently, this is a paper that I'm working with the same doctoral student on finalizing from his dissertation to send to one of our journals, is looking at the whole idea of legitimacy and how the legitimacy of a message leads, and people's perceptions of that lead to the intention to comply. And so do they cognitively, do they believe that it makes sense, that there's legitimacy in what it's asking to do? Is the message coming from someone that they believe has the moral legitimacy, that they believe who they are is telling me to do it, they have a place to be making that recommendation, and then pragmatic, that it just makes sense for what it is you're asking me to do, leads to that intention to comply. And then 3 different types of appeals coming from rhetorical theory: an ethos appeal, a logos appeal, and a pathos appeal, will all influence the type of legitimacy I see in that message. So we're hoping to get that out the door pretty soon. So that was a lot. I threw a lot out there, but I think it gives a good foundation for a lot of what we're doing in behavioral security space. Are there questions? I have about 10 minutes left.
I have been monitoring on the chat. No question has come so far, and I would encourage people to put in a question there. But let me begin by asking a question, Rob. So you gave a nice tour of all these theories that exist for behavioral security research, and protection motivation theory was one of them. And one thing I noticed in most of them, including this, is that you say the likelihood for this to happen, the likelihood for this to happen, for a trade, for an action or a behavior to come. When you say that likelihood, is there any more like probabilistic analysis that you do, sort of rigorous one, or in what sense do you use? How much does probability or other things play in that?
Yeah. So when we run our analyses, we end up with an R-squared and usually it's intention. So that's why I say it's the likelihood, is because we're looking at intention. So that is a level of people saying, yeah, I intend to behave that way. And so we don't ever have 100% explanatory power on a person's behavior. So as we look at these statistically significant relationships, we're looking at how much of the R-squared is being explained by a given construct. And so a really good R-squared would be around, above 0.5. But in a lot of these studies, we're only explaining about 25 to 50% of that intention. So there's other variables, other factors out there that could explain that. And thus why we have other theories that we continue to draw on to see if we can get a better explanation for these people's behaviors. And we oftentimes look at behavioral intention, or that likelihood that they would do something, because it's a much easier construct to measure than actual behavior. So to do a study where I'm asking you these perception questions to find out, what you appraise a threat at, or what you appraise your ability to cope with it is, to measure what your actual performance of writing your password down or something of that nature is either very difficult or impossible. And so a lot of the research does draw on intention, though there is a call to say, hey, who cares if it's hard? You need to figure out a way to do hard. And so that is where our field is moving, is saying, hey, how can we begin to capture people's actual behaviors as we do these studies, because that will be more telling than what people's intentions are.
Thanks. I have seen a hand, Ricardo. Yep. Maybe you can go ahead and ask your question.
Yes, thank you, Professor Crossler. I appreciate this talk. It's very interesting. One of the things that I wanted to bring up, I did a summer internship as a security software engineer for a government facility, and I was very interested in how they ran their security, because that is my field of study, cybersecurity, and one of their policies was see something, say something. And it was just a flat out general policy in every aspect, whether someone leaves their computer on or whatever it might be. And one of the things that I noticed as I observed different people was there was a strong pressure not to say something because of a sort of tattletale culture. Is that anything that you've considered in your studies, and how can we get around that mindset and move towards security as the main focus in all aspects of working environments, because it is the way we need to trend towards in these times.
Yeah, so what you're suggesting is captured in some of these studies, but not a whole lot. There hasn't been a whole lot of work done around this, but it's the whole idea of social influence, social norms. You might even get into a little bit of shame or trying to be liked in the organization. There's a lot of different ways that could probably be studied, and I think. There's something interesting there that people are going to, not want to be the narc. If I think about, my kids and their behavior, right? My brother, or not, my son probably isn't going to tattle on his brother because he doesn't, want his brother to be mad at him unless he's got good reason to want to get back at him for something. So rather psychologically something there that we want people to like us, and we don't want people to tattle on us, so we're not going to tattle on them. What I would, as I'm just sitting here thinking about this, what I think would be an interesting study would be, a policy communication around that whole see something, say something, and then, try to come up with, experimental conditions where people would have that opportunity to say something or not, and to see if you can create a culture to where saying something does not mean somebody else is going to get in trouble. One of the things that I've seen in the whole mindset of see something, say something is around the phishing space. Is if somebody is phished, we want them to own it, right? To say, oh, I shouldn't have clicked on that link as soon as I know I've done it, right? It's the whole fast response. I think we see it in WSU's training for all employees around cybersecurity. Is as soon as you recognize something's happened, you say something so something can be done about it. But if you punish people for that, then they're going to put their head in the sand. They're going to try not to get punished. But if you encourage that environment or that culture, and you reward that culture, and it makes it to where they're taking care of it, they know they're taking care of it, and they learn from it, I think you begin to change that. So if I were to do a study to dig into this, I would set up an experiment where we could see, does punishing versus rewarding people saying something, does that change it? And if, we look at even drawing from game theory, is it punishing the other person they say something about or not, would make a difference as well. So I think there's some good theoretical basis we could draw on to show that, positive encouragement is probably going to result in the behaviors we want more so than hitting people with a big stick.
So,
good question, yeah.
Thank you. So work toward the 3 appeals rather than the fear motivator.
Yeah, I mean, yeah. Well, if you work towards the fear appeals, but I think in contradicting, like, so if the fear appeal is focusing on the being afraid of what's going to happen to your information, right? That's what we want them to be afraid of. Is I want to be afraid something bad will happen to the information, not I want to be afraid that I'm going to be fired, right? So if we can look at fear being focused on, okay, I want to make sure the information's protected. I'm fear of it getting out, that some bad actor is going to access this. That's going to motivate me to do the right thing. But from a policy perspective and an individual, what's going to happen to me in my career for, saying something, or for, raising my hand when I know I've messed up, I think that's a different fear factor, right? There, we don't want people to be afraid of what's going to personally happen to them, because they're going to react in a way that may not be best aligned with taking care of organizational resources.
Thank
Does
you,
that make sense?
Professor. Yes.
Great. Any more questions?
I haven't seen any more questions. I will ask one more question, Rob, and this is probably a question that you would expect of a computer scientist, for example, like myself, right? So all of these theories that you have, kind of walked us through would eventually make you design surveys so that you see how people are behaving, or you may design some experiment like your student did with the Excel file and things like that, right? And that way you are trying to get a sense for how they're behaving. But their behavior could also, without necessarily designing the surveys, be sensed or observed through their activities if you have the right kind of things to capture them. So in all of this, people have done, is there an interaction between how these theories would not need you to go collect this by surveys or designing experiments, but capture, and this is where AI, machine learning, and things like that would come, but try to see how they are behaving and still continue with that theory without having, and it probably would capture the more real behavior of people. So is there work around this sort of things?
There is some work, and that's where the whole idea of capturing actual behaviors comes into play. And you see this a little bit, like you'll see some phishing studies that have been done where people are sent actual phishing messages, and then they're able to capture whether or not a person responded to them or not. But what makes this difficult a little bit is most of the time when you're asking people their perception questions, they're given anonymity, so we don't know who they are. But if we were to try to capture actual behaviors, let's say we had a log file on someone's computer, so we could capture everything that they're doing, all of their computer related behaviors, we would have to give up anonymity in their responses. We'd have to connect, who responded to their actual workstation and what their behaviors were. And so it would beg the question for, did we get those absolute right responses from them that were consistent? There wasn't a bias in there. So there's some ways to overcome that. Some cool things I've actually seen being done is some, there's an area of research in information systems called NeuroIS, which is neurological information systems, where there's people who've been put into CAT scan machines, and they can actually see how the brain is processing as they're making decisions. People who've had galvanic skin response and eye tracking software to see where they're drawn to in various different messages. So yeah, there are, I think, some ways to begin using some better technologies than just theories, and connecting these pieces together, which I think would be some very, very rich data to tell some interesting stories.
Awesome. We've only a couple minutes left, so I think probably this will be a great place to stop. We are going to continue this seminar series for the rest of the semester, and the next one will be on the 20th, and that's not a mistake. So students, you could be freer. That's President's Day. There is no class day, but there will be a CySER seminar. And so make sure that you tune in then, and information will be sent out. I'm going to ask Rob to send me the slides to me, to Gabriel, and we'll put it on the website. And so will the recording be. Other than that, I'd like to thank you, Rob, for a great presentation today. And I hope you have learned quite a bit, the students, from this. And we will see you in 2 weeks. And stop here.
Folks should fill out the survey, please.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, Gabriel had actually sent it. Thank you very much, Sola, for reminding me. Take the time. So you've got actually an additional 2-3 minutes that you could use this to start getting on and make sure to complete it. Thanks, Sola, very much for reminding me.
You're welcome, Asif. And thanks, Rob. Very nice presentation. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
A pleasure.